She is one of the most recognizable monsters in human history. A woman with snakes for hair and a gaze that turns living flesh to stone. Her name is whispered in fear, her face carved on shields and painted on pottery, her image immortalized in marble and bronze across millennia. But the Medusa you think you know, the hideous beast slain by the hero Perseus, is a lie. The truth is far more ancient, far more complex, and infinitely more terrifying than the sanitized myth taught in schools. For Medusa was not born a monster, she was made one. And the story of how a goddess became a demon reveals one of humanity's oldest and most disturbing transformations: the systematic destruction of the feminine divine. Tonight, we journey back through 5,000 years of human history to unmask the real Medusa. We will trace her evolution from a powerful protective deity worshipped across the ancient Mediterranean to the decapitated trophy of Greek heroic mythology. We will explore archaeological evidence, decode ancient symbols, and uncover the brutal, cultural forces that transformed a life-giving goddess into a death-dealing Gorgon. This is not just the story of a mythological creature. It is the story of how civilizations rewrite their own history, how conquerors erase the sacred, and how the powerful silence the voices of those they seek to control. The stone-cold killer was once a stone-cold goddess, and her true story begins not in Greece, but in the temples and burial grounds of civilizations that existed long before Homer ever sang of heroes and monsters. The ancient mother, to understand Medusa, we must first travel back to a time before. Greece existed as a unified culture, before the Olympian gods ruled from Mount Olympus, before the very concept of the hero's journey was carved into human consciousness. We must journey to the Neolithic period, roughly 8,000 years ago, when humanity was transitioning from hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural civilizations. In this ancient world, the dominant religious paradigm was not the sky god patriarchy that would later define classical mythology. Instead, it was centered around the worship of the Great Mother, a primordial feminine deity who embodied the cyclical powers of death and rebirth, destruction and creation. She was the earth itself, the source of all life, and the inevitable destination of all death. Archaeological evidence from across the Mediterranean basin reveals a consistent pattern of mother goddess worship that stretches from modern-day Turkey to Malta, from the Balkans to North Africa. These cultures created thousands of figurines, frescoes, and architectural monuments dedicated to a powerful feminine divine principle. And remarkably, many of these early representations share a striking characteristic with the later Greek Medusa. They feature prominently displayed eyes, often oversized and hypnotically compelling. The most significant of these discoveries comes from the temple complex of Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, dated to approximately 9500 BCE. Here, among the world's oldest known temple structures, archaeologists have uncovered carved stone pillars decorated with symbols that would later become associated with the Medusa myth. Spirals, snake-like forms, and most notably, large staring eyes that seem to watch visitors from beyond the veil of time. But it is in the later Neolithic cultures of old Europe, a term coined by archaeologist Maria Gimbutas to describe the peaceful, goddess-worshipping societies that flourished between 7000 and 3500 BCE, that we find the clearest precursors to the Medusa figure. Gimbutas, whose groundbreaking work revolutionized our understanding of prehistoric European religion, identified a specific type of goddess she called the gorgoneion, a fierce, protective deity characterized by large, staring eyes, often accompanied by snakes, spirals, and other symbols of regeneration. These gorgoneion figures were not monsters to be feared, but protective deities to be revered. Their powerful gaze was not a weapon of destruction, but a shield against evil. They adorned the entrances to homes, the facades of temples, and the burial goods of the dead. Their eyes were believed to watch over the community, protecting it from malevolent forces and ensuring the continuation of life's sacred cycles. The snake, which would later become Medusa's most distinctive feature, held profound positive symbolism in these ancient cultures. Unlike the Christian tradition that would eventually cast the serpent as a symbol of evil and temptation, Neolithic societies saw snakes as embodiments of wisdom, healing, and regeneration. The snake's ability to shed its skin made it a perfect symbol of renewal and rebirth, the endless cycle of death and resurrection that governed all natural processes. In the great goddess temples of Çatalhöyük in Turkey, dating to 7500 BCE, archaeologists have discovered shrines decorated with snake goddesses, whose bodies curve and spiral in serpentine forms. These deities were associated with the underworld, not as a place of punishment, but as the dark, fertile womb from which all life emerged. They were guardians of the mystery of death and rebirth, keepers of the profound secret that destruction and creation are merely two faces of the same cosmic process. The Minoan civilization of ancient Crete, which flourished from 2700 to 1100 BCE, provides perhaps the clearest link between these ancient goddess traditions and the later Greek Medusa myth. Minoan art is filled with powerful female figures holding snakes, their eyes wide and compelling, their presence both beautiful and terrible. The famous snake goddess figurines found in the palace of Knossos depict women with snakes coiled around, their arms and bodies, their faces serene, but their gaze intense and penetrating. These snake goddesses were not peripheral figures in Minoan religion, they were central to it. They presided over rituals of death and regeneration, oversaw the sacred mysteries that connected the living with the dead, and served as intermediaries between the human world and the realm of the divine. Their temples were places of healing and prophecy, where the sick came to be cured and the troubled came to seek guidance. The Minoans also created some of the earliest known representations of the Medusa head, circular designs featuring a central face surrounded by radiating lines, spirals, or serpentine forms. But unlike the later Greek gorgoneion, which was primarily used as an apotropaic symbol to ward off evil, the Minoan Medusa heads seem to have had a more complex function. They appeared on ritual vessels, sacred jewelry, and ceremonial objects, suggesting they were associated with positive divine power rather than mere protection. What emerges from this archaeological evidence is a picture of Medusa's ancient predecessor as a life-giving, rather than life-taking, deity. She was the Dark Mother who ruled over the mysteries of death, not as an enemy of life, but as its ultimate source. Her gaze did not turn things to stone out of malevolence, but transformed them as part of the natural order, just as winter transforms the landscape, preparing it for spring's renewal. This ancient Medusa was also closely associated with water, caves and underground spaces, the hidden, dark places where life gestates and from which it emerges. Many Neolithic goddess shrines have been found in caves or built to resemble cave-like spaces, emphasizing the connection between the divine feminine and the earth's secret depths. The goddess's serpent hair can be understood as representing the underground rivers and springs that bring life-giving water to the surface world. But perhaps most importantly, this primordial Medusa was a goddess of transformation itself. Her power was not static, but dynamic, not fixed, but constantly changing. She embodied the principle that nothing in the universe remains the same, that all existence is a continuous process of becoming, dying, and being reborn. Her petrifying gaze was originally a metaphor for the moment of profound change, the instant when one state of being gives way to another. This understanding of Medusa as a transformation goddess helps explain why her myth would later become so central to Greek culture, even as her nature was fundamentally altered. The Greeks, like all human societies, needed myths that helped them understand and cope with change, death, and the passage of time. But they would reshape the ancient goddess to fit their own cultural values and social structures, transforming her from a wise and powerful deity into a dangerous monster that needed to be defeated. The stage was thus set for one of history's most dramatic mythological reversals. The protective mother was about to become the destructive monster. The life-giver was about to become the life-taker, and the goddess was about to become the victim of her own heroic narrative. The birth of a monster. The transformation of Medusa from goddess to monster did not happen overnight. It was a gradual process that unfolded over centuries as the warrior cultures of Bronze Age Greece encountered, conquered, and eventually assimilated the peaceful goddess-worshipping societies of the Mediterranean. This collision between two fundamentally different worldviews, one celebrating the feminine divine, the other elevating masculine heroism, would fundamentally reshape European mythology and leave Medusa as its most tragic casualty. The earliest Greek references to Medusa appear in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, composed around the 8th century BCE but drawing on much older oral traditions. Already by Homer's time, Medusa has been transformed from a deity into a monster. She is described as one of the three Gorgon sisters, Stheno, Euryale, and Medusa, hideous creatures with brass hands, golden wings, and hair made of living snakes. Their gaze is so terrible that anyone who looks upon them is instantly turned to stone. But even in these earliest Greek sources, traces of Medusa's divine origin remain visible. Homer describes her head as being placed on Athena's aegis, the goddess's sacred shield, where it serves as a powerful protective emblem. This detail is crucial because it suggests that the Greeks themselves recognized Medusa's power as fundamentally protective rather than purely destructive. She may have become a monster in their stories, but her image still functioned as a guardian symbol. The most complete version of the Medusa myth comes to us through the Roman poet Ovid's Metamorphoses, written in the 1st century BCE, but based on much earlier Greek sources. Ovid's account is particularly significant because it provides an origin story for Medusa's monstrous transformation, and in doing so, reveals the deeply disturbing cultural dynamics that drove the mythological revision of the goddess figure. According to Ovid, Medusa was originally a beautiful mortal woman, a priestess of Athena renowned for her stunning hair. She caught the attention of Poseidon, the god of the sea, who pursued her relentlessly. When she sought refuge in Athena's temple, believing the sacred space would protect her, Poseidon followed her there and raped her on the altar itself. Rather than punishing Poseidon for this horrific violation of her temple and her priestess, Athena instead punished Medusa. The goddess transformed Medusa's beautiful hair into writhing snakes and cursed her with the deadly gaze, ensuring that no one could ever look upon her again without being turned to stone. Medusa was exiled from human society, forced to live in isolation, her very existence now a threat to all who encountered her. This version of the myth is particularly revealing because it encodes several disturbing messages about gender, power, and justice in ancient Greek society. First, it establishes that women are held responsible for the violence committed against them. Medusa is punished for being raped, while her rapist faces no consequences. Second, it suggests that female power, once awakened, is inherently dangerous and must be contained or destroyed. And third, it positions other women, represented by Athena, as complicit in the oppression of their own gender. But Ovid's account may actually be a later Roman interpretation of the myth, influenced by the poet's own literary and political agenda. Earlier, Greek sources suggest a different understanding of Medusa's nature and origins. Some scholars argue that the original Greek conception of Medusa was more complex, presenting her not as a victim-turned-monster, but as an primordial chthonic deity, an earth goddess, associated with the underworld and the mysteries of death and rebirth. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. Gorgon heads appear on Greek pottery, shields, and buildings from the 7th century BCE onward, but their function is clearly protective rather than threatening. They are placed on the entrances to homes, the facades of temples, and the armor of warriors, where they serve as apotropaic symbols, images designed to ward off evil and protect the bearer. This suggests that even as the Greeks developed increasingly elaborate myths about Medusa as a monster to be slain, they continued to recognize her power as fundamentally protective. The most famous artistic representation of this period is the gorgoneion from the Temple of Artemis at Corfu, dating to around 580 BCE. This massive stone sculpture shows Medusa not as a hideous monster, but as a powerful, even beautiful figure with snakes for hair and wings spread wide. Her face is fierce but not grotesque, her gaze intense but not monstrous. She is flanked by 2 leopards and surrounded by symbols of fertility and regeneration. Most significantly, she is shown giving birth to Pegasus and Chrysaor, the children she conceived with Poseidon, a detail that emphasizes her role as a creator rather than merely a destroyer. This artistic evidence suggests that the early Greeks maintained an ambivalent relationship with Medusa. On one hand, their myths increasingly portrayed her as a dangerous monster that needed to be defeated. On the other hand, their religious and artistic practices continue to invoke her as a protective and life-giving force. This contradiction reflects the broader cultural tension between the new patriarchal values of Greek society and the older goddess traditions they were working to supplant. The development of the Perseus myth represents the final stage in Medusa's transformation from goddess to monster. Perseus, the archetypal Greek hero, is tasked with killing Medusa and bringing back her head as proof of his triumph. The story follows the classic pattern of the hero's journey. A young man receives an impossible quest, obtains magical assistance from the gods, defeats a supernatural enemy, and returns home transformed by his victory. But the Perseus myth is more than just an adventure story. It is a religious and political allegory that encodes the victory of Greek patriarchal culture over the older, goddess-worshipping traditions. Perseus does not simply kill a monster, he destroys a goddess and claims her power for himself. The severed head of Medusa becomes his trophy, a symbol of masculine heroism triumphing over feminine divinity. The myth's emphasis on Perseus's use of a mirror to avoid looking directly at Medusa is particularly significant. By looking at Medusa's reflection, rather than at Medusa herself, Perseus avoids the transformative power of her gaze. This detail can be interpreted as a metaphor for the Greek cultural strategy of dealing with the goddess traditions. Rather than confronting them directly, they created distorted reflections that served their own purposes. Even more telling is what happens to Medusa's head after Perseus claims it. Rather than being destroyed, it is given to Athena, who places it on her aegis, where it continues to serve as a protective symbol. This detail reveals that the Greeks recognized they could not simply eliminate the goddess's power, they could only redirect it, channeling it through their own deities and into their own cultural framework. The Perseus myth also introduces several details that would become central to later interpretations of the Medusa story. The idea that Medusa was pregnant when she was killed, and that Pegasus and Chrysaea sprang from her blood, emphasizes her connection to fertility and creation, even at the moment of her destruction. The notion that her blood possessed both healing and poisonous properties suggests a continued recognition of her dual nature as both life-giver and life-taker. But perhaps most significantly, the myth establishes the pattern that would define Medusa's role in Western culture for the next 2 millennia. She becomes the embodiment of dangerous feminine power that must be conquered by masculine heroism. Her story becomes a template for countless later narratives in which male heroes prove their worth by defeating female monsters, witches, and other representations of uncontrolled feminine energy. This mythological framework had profound real-world consequences. By casting powerful women as monstrous threats to social order, Greek culture created a justification for the systematic subordination of women in all areas of life. The Medusa myth became part of a larger cultural project designed to establish male dominance as not just socially expedient but cosmically necessary, the natural order of things, ordained by the gods themselves. Yet, even as the Greeks transformed Medusa into a monster, they could not entirely erase the traces of her divine origin. The protective power of her image, the creative potential of her blood, the complex symbolism of her serpent hair, all these elements preserved echoes of her original nature as a goddess of transformation and renewal. These contradictions would continue to haunt her myth, creating the profound ambiguity that has made Medusa such a compelling figure for artists, writers, and thinkers throughout history. The birth of the monster, in other words, was also the beginning of her immortality. By transforming Medusa from a localized goddess into a universal symbol, the Greeks ensured that her story would transcend the boundaries of their own culture and speak to fundamental human concerns about power, transformation, and the relationship between civilization and the wild feminine divine. The serpent's wisdom, the snakes that crown Medusa's head, are far more than mere markers of her monstrous nature. They are symbols loaded with thousands of years of religious, mythological, and psychological meaning. To understand Medusa, we must first understand the serpent, for the snake is perhaps the most complex and contradictory symbol in human culture. Simultaneously representing wisdom and treachery, healing and poison, life and death, the sacred and the profane. In the ancient Mediterranean world that gave birth to the Medusa myth, snakes held a fundamentally different meaning than they would acquire in later Christian tradition. Rather than symbols of evil and temptation, they were creatures of profound spiritual significance, associated with healing, prophecy, and divine wisdom. The snake's ability to shed its skin made it a perfect metaphor for transformation, renewal, and the conquest of death. Its habit of emerging from underground burrows connected it to the chthonic realm, the mysterious underworld, from which all life springs and to which it ultimately returns. The medical profession still honors this ancient understanding of serpent symbolism through the rod of Asclepius, the staff entwined with a single snake that serves as the emblem of healing arts. Asclepius, the Greek god of medicine, was said to have learned the secrets of healing by observing snakes. His temples, known as Asclepions, often housed sacred serpents that were believed to bring healing dreams to pilgrims who slept in the temple precincts. The connection between snakes and healing was so fundamental to Greek medical practice that the phrase, "more healing than the serpent," became a common expression for describing particularly effective remedies. This positive symbolism of snakes was not unique to Greece, but was shared across the ancient world. In Egypt, the cobra goddess Wadjet was one of the most important protective deities, her image adorning the pharaoh's crown as a symbol of divine sovereignty. The uraeus, the rearing cobra, was believed to spit fire at the pharaoh's enemies while protecting him from harm. Similarly, in Mesopotamia, the snake was associated with Ninazu and Ningishzida, gods of the underworld and vegetation, who governed the cycles of death and rebirth that ensured agricultural fertility. But it was in the religious traditions of pre-Greek, Mediterranean cultures that serpent symbolism reached its most sophisticated development. The Minoan snake goddess figurines from Crete show women holding snakes not as weapons or sources of power, but as sacred creatures deserving of reverence and care. These goddesses appear calm and serene, their relationship with the serpents characterized by harmony rather than dominance. The snakes seem to flow naturally from their hands and around their bodies, suggesting a perfect integration between human and natural divine power. Archaeological evidence from across the region reveals that snake symbolism was particularly associated with goddesses of fertility, wisdom, and regeneration. At the Neolithic site of Sha'ar HaGolan in Israel, archaeologists have discovered thousands of clay figurines dating to 6400 BCE that combine human female forms with serpentine elements. These figures suggest that the association between women and snakes has roots that extend far deeper into prehistory than previously imagined. The connection becomes even more profound when we consider the biological parallels between serpents and feminine reproductive cycles. Like women, snakes periodically shed their outer covering and emerge renewed. The snake's sinuous movement echoes the flowing of menstrual blood and the rhythmic contractions of childbirth. The serpent's ability to unhinge its jaw and swallow prey larger than its head mirrors the expansive capacity of the womb during pregnancy and birth. These parallels were not lost on ancient peoples, who saw in the snake a reflection of the mysterious generative powers of the feminine divine. The oracle at Delphi, one of the most important religious sites in the Greek world, provides a fascinating example of how serpent symbolism became integrated into official Greek religion, even as its original goddess associations were being suppressed. According to myth, the site was originally guarded by Python, a great serpent sacred to the earth goddess Gaia. Apollo, the god of rational thought and masculine order, was said to have slayed Python and claimed the site for himself. Yet even after this mythological conquest, the Pythia, the oracle's priestess, retained her serpentine title, and her prophetic utterances were still understood to emerge from the chthonic depths over which the ancient serpent had once presided. This pattern of conquest and assimilation is crucial to understanding how Medusa's serpent hair should be interpreted. The Greeks did not simply demonize the snake, they incorporated its power into their own religious system while claiming dominance over it. Apollo may have killed Python, but he still needed the serpent's prophetic power to function as an oracular deity. Similarly, Perseus may have killed Medusa, but her head continued to serve as a protective symbol on Athena's shield. The psychological significance of Medusa's serpentine crown becomes even more apparent when we consider the role of hair in ancient Mediterranean cultures. Hair was understood as a source of personal power and spiritual energy, which is why cutting someone's hair was often a form of ritual humiliation or sacred offering. Samson's strength resided in his uncut locks. Celtic warriors believed their power flowed from their elaborately braided hair, and Greek women dedicated locks of hair to the gods during major life transitions. By transforming Medusa's hair into snakes, the myth preserves the idea that her head remains a source of tremendous power even after death. The serpents continue to writhe with life, suggesting that Medusa's essential nature, her connection to the forces of transformation and renewal, cannot be entirely destroyed. The snakes make her head a kind of Medusa in the biological sense, a stage in the life cycle of certain creatures where they exist as free-floating, autonomous entities capable of reproduction and renewal. The apotropaic function of Medusa's head, its ability to ward off evil when placed on shields, buildings, and amulets, can be understood as a continuation of the ancient serpent's protective role. Just as the cobra protected the pharaoh and the python guarded Delphi, Medusa's serpent-crowned head continued to serve as a guardian symbol. The snakes that had once been associated with healing and wisdom were transformed into agents of petrification, but their fundamental function as protectors remained unchanged. This transformation reveals something profound about how cultures adapt to changing religious and social circumstances. Rather than abandoning powerful symbols entirely, societies often reinterpret them to fit new paradigms. The snake's positive associations with healing and wisdom could not be entirely erased, so they were redirected into a new framework where the serpent's power served the interests of the dominant culture. The psychological dimension of Medusa's serpent hair becomes particularly relevant when we consider Carl Jung's analysis of snake symbolism in the collective unconscious. Jung identified the serpent as one of the most powerful archetypal symbols, representing the Kundalini energy that lies coiled at the base of the human psyche. This energy, when awakened, can lead to profound spiritual transformation and enlightenment, but it can also be dangerous if not properly integrated into conscious awareness. Medusa's serpentine hair can thus be understood as representing the untamed, transformative power of the unconscious mind, particularly the feminine unconscious that patriarchal societies have long sought to suppress and control. Her petrifying gaze becomes a metaphor for the paralyzing effect that contact with this repressed energy can have on those who are unprepared to integrate it. Perseus's use of a mirror to avoid direct confrontation with Medusa represents the ego's attempt to deal with unconscious contents indirectly through reflection and analysis rather than immediate experience. This interpretation helps explain why Medusa has remained such a compelling figure in psychology and feminist thought. She represents the return of the repressed feminine, the aspects of women's experience and power that patriarchal cultures have sought to deny or pathologize. Her serpent hair becomes a crown of wisdom, marking her as a keeper of ancient knowledge that dominant cultures have tried to suppress but cannot entirely destroy. The enduring power of serpent symbolism in Medusa's myth also reflects deep human anxieties about transformation itself. The snake that sheds its skin embodies the fundamental truth that all existence is impermanent, that change is the only constant, and that death and rebirth are inescapable aspects of the cosmic order. These are profound and unsettling truths that challenge human desires for stability, permanence, and control. By crowning Medusa with serpents, the myth acknowledges her role as a goddess of transformation, while simultaneously demonizing the very changes she represents. The snakes become symbols of chaos and danger rather than renewal and wisdom, reflecting a cultural shift away from acceptance of natural cycles toward a desire to transcend or control them. Yet the serpents remain vital and alive even on the severed head, suggesting that the transformative power they represent cannot be permanently destroyed. They continue to move, to threaten, to embody the wild feminine energy that civilization seeks to contain but cannot fully tame. In this way, Medusa's serpent hair serves as a permanent reminder that the goddess may have been defeated in myth, but her essential nature, her connection to the cycles of death and rebirth that govern all existence, remains eternally present, coiled and ready to strike at the heart of any culture arrogant enough to believe it has conquered the fundamental forces of life itself. The petrifying gaze of all the supernatural powers attributed to Medusa, none is more iconic or more mysterious than her petrifying gaze, the ability to turn living beings to stone with a single look. This power has captured human imagination for millennia, inspiring countless artistic interpretations, psychological analyses, and philosophical meditations on the nature of sight, transformation, and death. But to truly understand the significance of Medusa's gaze, we must look beyond its surface. function as a weapon and explore its deeper symbolic meanings as they developed across different cultures and historical periods. The concept of a deadly gaze was not unique to Greek mythology. Similar beliefs existed throughout the ancient Mediterranean world, reflecting a widespread understanding that sight was not a passive sense, but an active force capable of affecting the physical world. The evil eye, the belief that certain individuals could cause harm through malevolent looking, was documented across cultures from ancient Mesopotamia to Rome, and continues to influence folk beliefs in many parts of the world today. In ancient Greek thought, vision was understood according to the emission theory proposed by philosophers like Empedocles and later developed by Plato. This theory held that sight occurred not because light entered the eyes, but because the eyes themselves emitted rays that allowed them to perceive objects. This understanding made the concept of a deadly gaze scientifically plausible within the Greek worldview. If eyes emitted rays, then those rays could potentially carry harmful force. The petrifying power of Medusa's gaze, however, went far beyond the simple harm associated with the evil eye. Her look did not merely injure or kill. It transformed living, breathing beings into lifeless stone, preserving their forms while destroying their essence. This specific form of transformation carries profound symbolic weight that reveals much about ancient Greek anxieties regarding death, time, and the relationship between life and art. Petrification, as a form of death, is uniquely disturbing because it preserves the appearance of life while eliminating its reality. Unlike a corpse, which visibly decays and returns to the earth, a petrified victim remains forever frozen at the moment of transformation, neither fully alive nor properly dead. This liminal state, caught between existence and non-existence, reflects deep human fears about the nature of consciousness and the possibility that death might not bring complete extinction, but rather an eternal state of trapped awareness. The archaeological record reveals that the Greeks were intimately familiar with actual petrification through their encounters with fossils and mineral formations that resembled living creatures. Ancient writers like Pliny the Elder documented numerous instances of seemingly organic materials that had been turned to stone, lending credibility to the idea that such transformations were possible. The prevalence of marble sculpture in Greek culture also created a visual landscape where stone figures of humans and animals were commonplace, making the concept of petrification feel less fantastical and more like a reversal of the artistic process. But the symbolic significance of Medusa's gaze extends far beyond literal petrification. In many interpretations, her look represents the moment of recognition, the instant when hidden truths are revealed and illusions are shattered. The victim who meets her gaze is not simply killed, but enlightened, forced to confront realities so profound and terrible that they cannot be processed by the living mind. Petrification becomes a metaphor for the overwhelming nature of ultimate truth, the way that perfect knowledge can paralyze rather than liberate. This interpretation is supported by the consistent association between Medusa and mirrors in Greek art and literature. Perseus defeats her by looking at her reflection rather than directly at her face, suggesting that her true power can only be approached indirectly, through symbolic representation rather than immediate experience. The mirror becomes a mediating device that allows dangerous knowledge to be safely processed, transforming the lethal directness of her gaze into a manageable reflection. The psychological dimension of Medusa's petrifying power has been extensively explored by modern analysts, particularly those working within Jungian and feminist frameworks. Carl Jung interpreted the Medusa head as representing the terrible mother archetype, the destructive aspect of the feminine that must be confronted and integrated before psychological wholeness can be achieved. In this reading, petrification represents the paralysis that occurs when individuals are overwhelmed by contact with unconscious contents they are not prepared to integrate. Feminist scholars have offered alternative interpretations that focus on the gaze as a form of female power that patriarchal cultures find threatening. The petrifying look becomes a metaphor for the way that women's authentic vision, their ability to see through social pretenses and cultural myths, can be experienced as dangerous by those who benefit from existing power structures. Medusa's gaze reveals uncomfortable truths about masculine heroism, divine justice, and social order that threaten the foundations of patriarchal society. This interpretation gains particular resonance when we consider the specific nature of Perseus's heroic quest. He is tasked with obtaining Medusa's head not because she has committed any crime or threatened any community, but because King Polydectes wants to remove Perseus as an obstacle to his pursuit of Perseus's mother, Danae. The entire quest is motivated by male sexual competition, rather than any genuine threat posed by Medusa herself. Her petrifying gaze can thus be understood as a defense mechanism, a way of protecting herself from male aggression rather than an indiscriminate weapon of destruction. The artistic tradition of depicting Medusa's face frontally, staring directly at the viewer, reinforces this protective interpretation. Unlike most figures in ancient art, who are shown in profile or three-quarter view, Medusa confronts the observer with a direct, challenging gaze that seems to dare them to meet her eyes. This frontal presentation makes every viewer a potential Perseus, forced to confront their own motivations and prejudices about female power and monstrous femininity. The petrifying gaze also functions as a metaphor for the artistic process itself. Sculpture, painting, and other visual arts essentially petrify their subjects, capturing a moment in time and preserving it in permanent form. The artist's gaze, like Medusa's, transforms living reality into static representation. This connection between Medusa and artistic creation helps explain why her image became so central. To later Renaissance and Romantic art, she represents both the subject and the method of artistic representation. Leonardo da Vinci's lost painting of Medusa, known only through historical descriptions, reportedly depicted her head with such realistic horror that viewers recoiled in fear, believing they were seeing the actual Gorgon rather than a mere representation. This anecdote illustrates the way that artistic skill can create its own form of petrification, fixing viewers in states of aesthetic shock that parallel the mythological effects of Medusa's gaze. The temporal dimension of petrification is equally significant. While most forms of death involve a process of transformation and decay, petrification stops time, creating an eternal moment that never changes or progresses. This aspect of Medusa's power reflects ancient Greek anxieties about time, memory, and the preservation of identity beyond death. The stone victims of her gaze achieve a form of immortality, but it is an immortality of stasis rather than continuation, a parody of the eternal life promised by various religious traditions or archaeological evidence suggests that the Greeks may have connected Medusa's petrifying power to actual geological phenomena. Sites associated with the Gorgons often featured unusual rock formations, natural stone pillars, or mineral deposits that could be interpreted as the remains of petrified victims. The landscape itself became part of the myth, providing physical evidence for the reality of Medusa's transformative power. The influence of Medusa's petrifying gaze extended far beyond Greek culture, appearing in various forms throughout European folklore and eventually influencing global popular culture. The basilisk of medieval legend possessed a similar deadly look, as did various witches and supernatural creatures in folk traditions. The concept evolved to encompass not just literal petrification, but metaphorical forms of paralysis, the way that certain experiences or encounters can leave individuals psychologically frozen and unable to move forward. Modern interpretations have expanded the symbolic range of the petrifying gaze to include the effects of trauma, the paralysis of depression, and the way that oppressive social systems can freeze individuals in states of powerlessness. Medusa's look becomes a metaphor for any force that transforms dynamic, living beings into static, lifeless objects, whether through violence, oppression, or the crushing weight of social expectations. Yet even as her gaze petrifies, it also preserves. The stone victims of Medusa remain forever as they were at the moment of transformation, immune to further change or decay. This preservation suggests that petrification might be understood not only as a form of death but as a form of immortality, a way of escaping the normal processes of aging and dissolution that govern mortal existence. This dual nature of the petrifying gaze, simultaneously destructive and preservative, reflects the broader ambiguity that characterizes Medusa. Throughout her mythological development, she is a figure who embodies contradiction, representing both the terror of transformation and the comfort of stasis, both the danger of authentic vision and the safety of artistic representation. Her gaze forces viewers to confront fundamental questions about the nature of sight. the relationship between observer and observed, and the complex ways that power operates through the act of looking. In the end, the true power of Medusa's petrifying gaze may lie not in its ability to turn flesh to stone, but in its capacity to transform observers into questioners, individuals who cannot simply accept surface appearances, but must grapple with the deeper meanings hidden beneath the obvious. Her look challenges us to examine our own assumptions about monstrosity and beauty, danger and protection, feminine power and masculine heroism. It petrifies not our bodies but our certainties, leaving us frozen in moments of profound questioning that can ultimately lead to new forms of understanding and growth. The shield of Athena the Phui, transformation of Medusa from a living goddess to a severed head adorning Athena's shield, represents one of the most psychologically complex elements of her myth. This detail, present in sources from Homer onwards, reveals the intricate ways that Greek culture absorbed, redefined, and repurposed the symbols of older religious traditions. The aegis, Athena's supernatural breastplate or shield bearing Medusa's head, became one of the most recognizable symbols in classical art, but its significance extends far beyond mere decoration to encompass profound questions about divine power, cultural appropriation, and the relationship between protection and destruction. According to Greek mythology, after Perseus successfully beheaded Medusa, he presented the head to Athena, who placed it at the center of her aegis. This supernatural garment, described variously as a breastplate, cloak, or shield, became one of Athena's most distinctive attributes. When worn or displayed, the aegis struck terror into enemies and provided divine protection to allies. The Medusa head at its center retained all of its petrifying power. But now that power served the purposes of the Olympian gods rather than threatening them, this appropriation of Medusa's power by Athena is particularly significant because it reveals how Greek culture dealt with the goddess traditions it was working to supplant. Rather than simply destroying these powerful symbols, the Greeks incorporated them into their own religious system, but in subordinated roles that served their new pantheon. The living goddess became a dead trophy. The independent deity became a tool in the hands of another god. The agent of transformation became a static emblem of state power. The choice of Athena as Medusa's ultimate possessor is highly symbolic. As the goddess of wisdom, warfare, and civilization, Athena represents the values that Greek culture most prized: rational thought, strategic planning, and ordered society. She is often depicted as the patron deity of heroes, providing them with the intelligence and tools they need to overcome chaotic forces and establish civilized order. By placing Medusa's head on Athena's aegis, the myth suggests that the wild, transformative power of the ancient goddess has been tamed and redirected to serve the cause of civilization itself. But the relationship between Athena and Medusa is more complex than simple appropriation. Some versions of the myth suggest that Athena and Medusa were once closely connected, even before the latter's transformation into a monster. Both were associated with serpents, both possessed the power to paralyze enemies with fear, and both served protective functions for their devotees. Athena herself was often depicted with serpentine attributes, and her temple on the Acropolis housed a sacred snake that was believed to protect the city of Athens. The aegis itself predates its association with Medusa's head. In Homer's Iliad, Zeus possesses an aegis that he can shake to create thunder and lightning, striking fear into both mortals and immortals. The word aegis derives from the Greek word for goat, suggesting that the original garment may have been made from goatskin or associated with goat symbolism. The addition of Medusa's head to this already powerful divine artifact represents a fusion of different mythological traditions, the sky god's thunder weapon combined with the earth goddess's petrifying power. Archaeological evidence reveals that the gorgoneion, artistic representations of Medusa's head, appeared on shields, buildings, and other protective objects throughout the Greek world from the 7th century BCE onward. These images served an apotropaic function, warding off evil and protecting the bearer from harm. The fact that the same symbol that represented the ultimate monster in Greek mythology also served as the ultimate protection reveals the profound ambivalence that characterized the culture's relationship with Medusa.
The artistic development of the gorgoneion on Athena's aegis shows a gradual evolution from terrifying monster head to more stylized, decorative element. Early representations show Medusa with a horrifying face, bulging eyes, protruding tongue, and writhing snakes for hair. Over time, these features became more refined and less overtly monstrous, suggesting that the symbol's protective function was becoming more important than its terrifying aspect. This evolution reflects a broader pattern in how cultures adapt powerful symbols over time. The raw, chaotic energy of the original goddess figure is gradually domesticated and incorporated into established religious and artistic traditions. The terrifying face becomes a beautiful decoration. The independent deity becomes a subordinate symbol. The living goddess becomes a dead emblem of state power. The psychological dimension of Athena. Appropriation of Medusa's head reveals complex dynamics around feminine power and its control by patriarchal institutions. Athena, despite being a goddess, represents a very specific type of femininity that Greek culture found acceptable. She is a virgin warrior who serves male interests, supports masculine heroes, and never challenges the authority of the patriarchal order. By contrast, Medusa represents the aspects of feminine power that patriarchal cultures find threatening: sexuality, transformation, and independence from male control. The placement of Medusa's head on Athena's aegis can thus be understood as a symbolic representation of how patriarchal societies co-opt and redirect feminine power. The dangerous, independent goddess is killed, and her power is transferred to a safe female deity who will use it to support rather than challenge masculine authority. Medusa's capacity for transformation becomes Athena's tool for maintaining order. Her terrifying independence becomes divine protection for Greek heroes. This interpretation is supported by the specific circumstances under which Athena typically displays her aegis in Greek literature. She does not use it to pursue her own independent goals, but rather to assist male heroes in their quests, protect Greek armies in battle, or maintain the authority of the Olympian order. Medusa's power becomes instrumentalized, serving purposes that may be directly opposed to her original nature as a goddess of transformation and change. The myth of how Athena acquired Medusa's head also reveals important aspects of divine politics in the Greek pantheon. Perseus does not keep the head for himself despite being the one who killed Medusa. He gives it to Athena as a gift, suggesting that mortal heroes are not capable of wielding such power independently. Only a deity can safely control the force of the petrifying gaze, and only a deity aligned with the interests of civilization can be trusted to use it responsibly. This detail reinforces the hierarchical nature of power in Greek mythology, where mortals serve gods and gods serve the larger cosmic order. Perseus's gift of Medusa's head to Athena represents his acknowledgement that he was merely an instrument in a larger divine plan, not the ultimate beneficiary of his heroic actions. The true victor in the story is not the human hero, but the goddess who ends up possessing the prize. The continuing power of Medusa's severed head also raises fascinating questions about the nature of death and consciousness in Greek thought. Unlike ordinary mortal beings, whose power dies with their bodies, Medusa's head retains all of its supernatural abilities, even after being severed from her body. This suggests that her essential nature transcends physical form, that the goddess's power is so fundamental that it cannot be destroyed. only transferred or redirected. The blood that flows from Medusa's severed neck provides another example of her continuing vitality. According to myth, this blood possessed both healing and poisonous properties, capable of bringing either life or death depending on how it was used. Perseus is said to have given some of this blood to the physician Asclepius, who used it to develop powerful medicines. This detail suggests that even in death, Medusa remained a source of both creative and destructive power. The transformation of Medusa's head into a protective symbol also reflects broader patterns in how cultures deal with traumatic historical transitions. The violent conquest of goddess-worshipping societies by patriarchal warrior cultures created psychological wounds that needed to be healed or at least covered over. By transforming the slain goddess into a protective emblem, Greek culture found a way to acknowledge the power of what it had destroyed, while ensuring that this power would serve its new masters rather than challenging them. The enduring popularity of the Athena Medusa aegis in later art and literature demonstrates the psychological effectiveness of this mythological solution. The symbol allowed people to access the protective power of the ancient goddess, while remaining safely within the bounds of acceptable religious orthodoxy. They could invoke Medusa's power without worshipping Medusa, benefit from her protection without acknowledging her independence. This pattern of appropriation and domestication would be repeated throughout Western cultural history as Christianity and other dominant religions encountered and absorbed local goddess traditions. The powerful female deities of conquered peoples would be transformed into saints, demons, or decorative symbols, their original significance obscured but never entirely erased. Medusa's head on Athena's aegis became a template for how patriarchal cultures could acknowledge the power of the feminine divine while ensuring that this power remained safely under masculine control. Yet even in this subordinated form, Medusa's head retained a subversive potential that would emerge in later artistic and literary treatments. The very fact that her power could not be destroyed, only transferred, suggested that the goddess traditions she represented possessed a vitality that transcended their historical defeat. The severed head continued to stare out from Athena's shield with its own independent gaze, reminding viewers that the ancient powers had not been eliminated, but merely temporarily contained. The Roman reflection, the Roman encounter with Greek mythology, fundamentally transformed the Medusa story, shifting it from a religious narrative to a literary and artistic exploration of power, beauty, and transformation. While the Greeks had developed the basic mythological framework, it was Roman writers and artists who gave the story its psychological depth and moral complexity, creating the version that would most profoundly influence later Western culture. The most significant Roman contribution to the Medusa myth came from the poet Ovid, whose metamorphoses provided the most complete and psychologically nuanced account of her transformation from beautiful priestess to monster. Writing during the reign of Augustus in the early 1st century CE, Ovid was part of a literary movement that sought to reinterpret traditional Greek myths in ways that spoke to Roman sensibilities and concerns. Ovid's version of the Medusa story is revolutionary in its focus on the victim rather than the hero. While earlier Greek sources had emphasized Perseus's courage and cleverness in slaying the monster, Ovid chose to explore the tragedy of Medusa herself, how she became monstrous, what injustices she suffered, and how her transformation reflected broader patterns of divine and human cruelty. This shift in perspective would prove enormously influential, providing the foundation for later feminist and psychological interpretations of the myth. Medusa begins as a beautiful mortal woman, notable particularly for her magnificent hair. She serves as a priestess in Athena's temple, a position that requires her to maintain her virginity and dedicate her life to the goddess. This detail immediately establishes Medusa as a figure caught between competing demands. Her natural beauty attracts male attention, but her religious vows require her to resist such advances. The rape of Medusa by Poseidon in Athena's temple represents one of the most psychologically complex episodes in classical mythology. Ovid presents it not as a romantic encounter, but as a violent assault that violates both Medusa personally and the sacred space she was sworn to protect. The god of the sea pursues her relentlessly, ignoring her attempts to escape and finally cornering her in what should have been her safest refuge. The temple setting of the rape is crucial to understanding its symbolic significance. Temples in the ancient world were not merely buildings, but sacred spaces that existed outside normal social and legal boundaries. To commit violence in a temple was to violate the most fundamental laws of both human and divine society. Poseidon's action represents not just personal assault, but cosmic disorder, breakdown of the very principles that were supposed to maintain civilized order. Athena's response to this violation reveals the deep contradictions within Greek and Roman religious thinking about gender, justice, and divine power. Rather than punishing Poseidon for his assault, the goddess punishes Medusa for being its victim. She transforms Medusa's beautiful hair into writhing snakes and curses her with the petrifying gaze, ensuring that no one will ever be able to look upon her again without being turned to stone. This victim response has been interpreted by modern scholars as reflecting the patriarchal values of both Greek and Roman society, where women were often held responsible for the violence committed against them. But Ovid's presentation of the story suggests a more complex critique of divine justice. By focusing on the injustice of Medusa's punishment, he implicitly questions the moral authority of the gods themselves and suggests that divine power is often exercised in ways that are arbitrary and cruel. Transformation of Medusa's hair from beautiful locks to writhing serpents carries profound symbolic weight in the Roman context. Hair was a crucial marker of feminine beauty and social status in Roman culture. Elite Roman women spent enormous amounts of time and money on elaborate hairstyles that demonstrated their wealth and refinement. The destruction of Medusa's hair thus represents not just physical transformation, but social death. She is stripped of her identity as a beautiful woman and cast out from civilized society. The serpents that replace her hair connect Medusa to a complex web of Roman associations with wisdom, healing, and transformation. The Romans inherited the Greek understanding of snakes as symbols of medical knowledge and spiritual insight, but they also developed their own interpretations that emphasized the creature's connection to the underworld and the mysteries of death and rebirth. Roman artists developed distinctive visual representations of Medusa that differed significantly from their Greek predecessors. While Greek gorgoneion typically emphasized the monster's terrifying aspects, bulging eyes, protruding tongue, fearsome expression, Roman versions often retained elements of her former beauty. This beautiful Medusa tradition created images that were simultaneously attractive and repulsive, beautiful and terrible, drawing viewers in while warning them of the danger of looking too closely. This artistic evolution reflects a broader Roman interest in psychological complexity and moral ambiguity, where Greek art often presented clear distinctions between heroes and monsters, beautiful and ugly, good and evil. Roman artists were drawn to figures who embodied contradictions and challenged simple moral categorizations. The beautiful Medusa became a perfect symbol for this aesthetic preference, representing the dangerous allure of beauty and the tragic consequences of victimization. Roman writers also developed new interpretations of Perseus's victory over Medusa that reflected their own cultural values and anxieties. While Greek versions had emphasized the hero's courage and divine assistance, Roman accounts often focused on the technological and strategic aspects of his success. Perseus's use of Athena's polished shield as a mirror was interpreted as an example of Roman ingenuity, application of practical intelligence to overcome seemingly impossible challenges. This technological emphasis reflects broader Roman cultural patterns that celebrated engineering prowess and strategic thinking over purely physical courage. The Romans were master builders and military tacticians who understood the power of superior equipment and careful planning. Perseus's victory became a metaphor for Roman cultural values, triumph of disciplined intelligence over chaotic natural force. The Roman appropriation of the Medusa myth also reflected their complex relationship with Greek culture more generally. While the Romans deeply admired Greek art, literature, and philosophy, they also needed to establish their own cultural identity as something distinct from and superior to their Greek predecessors. The reinterpretation of Greek myths provided one way to accomplish this goal, allowing Romans to demonstrate their sophistication while asserting their own moral and intellectual superiority. The political dimensions of the Medusa myth became particularly important during the Roman imperial period. The image of Perseus holding Medusa's severed head was adopted as a symbol of imperial power, representing the emperor's ability to overcome chaotic forces and maintain order throughout the empire. The Medusa head itself became an apotropaic symbol used on military standards, public buildings, and imperial regalia. This political appropriation of the myth reveals how symbols that began as religious narratives can be transformed into instruments of state power. The ancient goddess who had once represented the wild, transformative forces of nature became a trophy demonstrating the emperor's divine mandate to rule. Her severed head, displayed on shields and monuments throughout the empire, served as a warning to potential rebels and a promise of protection to loyal citizens. The Roman legal system also found uses for Medusa symbolism, particularly in contexts involving crimes against women and violations of sacred spaces. The myth's emphasis on the consequences of sexual violence in religious settings resonated with Roman legal concerns about maintaining public order and protecting religious institutions. Some legal documents from the imperial period use Medusa imagery to illustrate the terrible consequences that await those who violate sacred laws. Roman philosophical schools developed their own interpretations of the Medusa myth that emphasized its value as a moral and psychological allegory. Stoic philosophers used the story to illustrate their teachings about the relationship between external circumstances and internal peace. Medusa's transformation was interpreted as an example of how individuals could maintain their essential dignity even when subjected to extreme external pressures and injustices. Philosophers found in the myth a complex allegory about the relationship between beauty and truth, appearance and reality. Medusa's petrifying gaze was interpreted as representing the danger of becoming too attached to surface appearances rather than seeking deeper spiritual truths. Perseus's use of a mirror to defeat her was seen as symbolizing the philosopher's need to approach ultimate reality indirectly, through rational reflection rather than direct intuition. These philosophical interpretations would prove enormously influential in later European thought, providing intellectual frameworks that allowed medieval and Renaissance thinkers to find Christian and humanistic meanings in pagan mythological narratives. The Roman transformation of Medusa from monster to symbol, from religious narrative to psychological allegory, created the interpretive foundation that would support thousands of years of artistic and literary reinterpretation. The Roman period also saw the development of mystery religions that incorporated Medusa symbolism into their secret initiation rites. These cults, which offered personal salvation and spiritual transformation to their members, found in Medusa's story a powerful metaphor for the death and rebirth that characterizes all genuine spiritual development. The petrifying gaze was reinterpreted as representing the moment of spiritual awakening, the instant when conventional reality is revealed as illusion and the initiate is transformed into a new kind of being. By the end of the Roman period, Medusa had been transformed from a localized Greek monster into a universal symbol capable of carrying multiple layers of meaning. Roman writers and artists had given her a psychological interiority and moral complexity that would make her relevant to future generations grappling with questions of beauty and ugliness, justice and injustice, power and victimization. Their reinterpretation of her myth created the template that would guide Western culture's engagement with her story for the next 2 millennia. The Roman Medusa was no longer simply a monster to be slain, but a tragic figure whose story illuminated the complex relationships between gender, power, and divine justice. She had become a mirror in which each age could see its own reflections, its own struggles with the eternal questions of how societies should treat their most vulnerable members and how individuals should respond to injustice and transformation. The Renaissance, resurrection, the rediscovery of classical texts during the European Renaissance brought Medusa back from the margins of medieval Christian culture into the center of artistic and intellectual discourse. Renaissance humanists, artists, and philosophers found in her myth a rich source of symbolic material that could be adapted to address contemporary concerns about art, beauty, power, and human nature. This period witnessed an extraordinary flowering of Medusa imagery that transformed her from a medieval symbol of sin and temptation into a complex emblem of artistic creation, political power, and psychological truth. The Renaissance encounter with Medusa was mediated primarily through Roman sources, particularly Ovid's Metamorphoses, which had been preserved throughout the medieval period, and became one of the most widely read and influential texts of the Renaissance. Humanist scholars like Giovanni Boccaccio and Cristoforo Landino created detailed commentaries on Ovid's work that provided allegorical interpretations suitable for Christian readers while preserving the psychological complexity of the original narratives. These commentaries presented Medusa as a figure whose story could be read on multiple levels simultaneously. On the literal level, she remained the monster slain by Perseus in his heroic quest. On the moral level, she represented the dangers of pride, vanity, and uncontrolled passion. On the allegorical level, she symbolized the transformation of the soul through spiritual discipline. And on the anagogical level, she pointed toward ultimate spiritual truths about the relationship between earthly beauty and divine perfection. This multivalent interpretive approach allowed Renaissance artists and writers to engage with Medusa's myth without abandoning Christian orthodoxy. But it also opened up creative possibilities that had been impossible during the medieval period. Artists could now explore the psychological and aesthetic dimensions of her story, while claiming to serve morally instructive purposes. The most famous Renaissance engagement with the Medusa myth came from Leonardo da Vinci, who reportedly painted a shield decorated with Medusa's head that was so realistic, viewers recoiled in terror, believing they were seeing the actual Gorgon. While this painting has been lost, its legendary status reveals the Renaissance fascination with art's power to create illusions so convincing they could affect viewers physically and emotionally. Leonardo's approach to the Medusa image exemplified key Renaissance concerns about the relationship between art and nature, illusion and reality. His version reportedly featured not just the traditional snakes, but a writhing mass of various creatures, lizards, bats, and other small animals merging from the head in a composition that was simultaneously beautiful and horrible. This multiplication of natural forms reflected Renaissance interest in the diversity and complexity of the natural world, while maintaining the traditional emphasis on Medusa's monstrous nature. The use of Medusa imagery in Renaissance political contexts reveals how classical mythology was adapted to serve contemporary power structures. The Medici family of Florence, whose name coincidentally echoed that of the ancient Gorgon, adopted Medusa symbolism as part of their visual identity. They commissioned numerous works of art featuring Perseus and Medusa that served as allegories for their own political triumphs over republican forces and rival families. Benvenuto Cellini's bronze Perseus with the head of Medusa, completed in 1554 for Cosimo I de' Medici, represents perhaps the most sophisticated Renaissance treatment of the myth. The sculpture, which stands in the Loggia dei Lanzi in Florence, presents Perseus as a beautiful, idealized young man holding Medusa's severed head aloft in triumph. But Cellini's treatment is psychologically complex, showing both Perseus and Medusa as beautiful figures whose encounter represents a tragic collision between different forms of perfection. Cellini's Medusa head is not the hideous monster of medieval imagination, but a beautiful woman whose face shows pain and sorrow rather than rage or malevolence. Her closed eyes suggest that death has brought peace rather than continued torment, while the snakes in her hair seem to mourn rather than threaten. This humanization of the monster reflects Renaissance interest in the psychological complexity of mythological figures and the tragic dimensions of heroic narratives. The sculpture's political symbolism was equally sophisticated. Perseus was understood to represent Cosimo I himself, while Medusa symbolized the republican forces he had defeated in establishing Medici dominance over Florence. But the beauty of both figures suggested that this victory was achieved through the triumph of superior artistic and cultural refinement rather than mere military force. The Medici were presenting themselves as benevolent rulers whose power derived from their patronage of art and learning. Renaissance painters developed their own distinctive approaches to Medusa imagery that reflected period concerns about beauty, transformation, and artistic creation. Caravaggio's Medusa, painted on a ceremonial shield around 1597, presents the Gorgon at the moment of her death, her face showing shock and horror as she realizes what has happened to her. The painting's dramatic use of light and shadow, chiaroscuro, creates an image that is simultaneously repulsive and compelling, drawing viewers into intimate psychological engagement with the dying monster. Caravaggio's treatment reflects the Counter-Reformation emphasis on emotional engagement with religious and mythological narratives. His Medusa is not a distant symbol, but an immediate presence whose suffering evokes empathy, even as her monstrous nature inspires fear. This psychological approach to mythological subjects would become characteristic of Baroque art, but its origins can be traced to Renaissance experimentation with classical themes. The period also saw the development of elaborate allegorical interpretations that connected Medusa to contemporary intellectual and spiritual concerns. Renaissance Neoplatonists like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola found in her myth a complex allegory about the soul's journey toward divine truth. Medusa represented the material world that must be transcended through philosophical contemplation, while Perseus symbolized the rational soul armed with divine wisdom. These philosophical interpretations were often combined with astrological and hermetic symbolism that reflected Renaissance interest in occult knowledge and hidden correspondences between different levels of reality. Medusa became associated with Saturn, the planet of melancholy and transformation, while Perseus was linked to Mercury, the messenger god who mediated between earthly and divine realms. Renaissance poetry also produced significant reinterpretations of the Medusa myth that emphasized its relevance to contemporary concerns about love, beauty, and artistic creation. Poets like Pietro Bembo and Ludovico Ariosto used Medusa imagery to explore the paradoxical nature of romantic love, which could simultaneously inspire and destroy, elevate and debase, create and petrify. The period's most psychologically complex treatment of Medusa themes appeared in Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene, where the Gorgon appears not as a single character, but as a principle of paralyzing fear that must be overcome through courage and virtue. Spenser's allegorical approach allowed him to explore the psychological dimensions of the myth while maintaining its moral and spiritual significance within a Christian framework. Renaissance scholars also made important contributions to the historical and archaeological understanding of Medusa imagery. Humanist antiquarians like Andrea Fulvio and Flavio Biondo began systematic studies of ancient Roman and Greek artifacts that featured Gorgon imagery, attempting to reconstruct the original cultural contexts and meanings of these symbols. Their work laid the foundation for modern archaeological approaches to classical mythology. The period's scientific developments also influenced interpretations of the Medusa myth. Renaissance natural philosophers were fascinated by the process of petrification, which they observed in fossils and mineral formations. Some theorists attempted to provide rational explanations for Medusa's power, suggesting that it might be based on actual knowledge of substances or techniques that could transform organic materials into stone. These proto-scientific approaches to mythology reflected broader Renaissance tensions between emerging rational methodologies and traditional symbolic thinking. Scholars wanted to preserve the moral and aesthetic value of classical myths while subjecting them to new forms of critical analysis. The result was often a complex synthesis that maintained mythological narratives while providing naturalistic explanations for their supernatural elements. Renaissance transformation of Medusa also reflected changing attitudes toward feminine power and sexuality. While medieval Christianity had generally viewed powerful women as dangerous threats to spiritual and social order, Renaissance humanism developed more complex perspectives that acknowledged both the creative and destructive potential of feminine energy. This shift is visible in Renaissance artistic treatments that often emphasized original beauty and the tragedy of her transformation, rather than simply her monstrous nature. Artists began to explore the psychological dimensions of her victimization, creating images that evoked sympathy for her suffering while maintaining awareness of her dangerous power. The period's marriage culture also influenced interpretations of the Perseus and Medusa story. Renaissance marriage theory emphasized the importance of male dominance and female submission in creating harmonious relationships, and the myth was sometimes interpreted as an allegory for the proper ordering of gender relationships within marriage and society. Yet Renaissance artists and writers also began to explore alternative interpretations that questioned traditional gender hierarchies. Some works presented Medusa as a figure of tragic nobility whose destruction represented a loss of valuable feminine wisdom and power. These interpretations would prove influential in later feminist rereadings of the myth. By the end of the Renaissance, Medusa had been thoroughly integrated into European artistic and intellectual culture as a figure of enormous symbolic richness and flexibility. Renaissance treatments had established her as a legitimate subject for serious artistic and philosophical exploration, while developing interpretive frameworks that would continue to influence Western culture's engagement with her myth for centuries to come. The Renaissance resurrection of Medusa thus represented more than simply the recovery of a classical symbol. It marked the creation of new forms of cultural meaning that reflected contemporary concerns while drawing on ancient wisdom. The period's artists and thinkers had transformed her from a medieval emblem of sin into a complex symbol of artistic creation, political power, psychological truth, and spiritual transformation that would continue to evolve and inspire new interpretations in subsequent centuries. The modern gaze. The 19th and 20th centuries witnessed a revolutionary transformation in how Western culture understood and interpreted the Medusa myth. Psychology, feminism, and modern art combined to create new readings that challenged traditional heroic narratives and revealed previously hidden dimensions of symbolic meaning. This modern engagement with Medusa moved beyond the aesthetic and allegorical approaches of earlier periods to explore fundamental questions about trauma, gender, power, and the nature of the human psyche. The emergence of psychology as a scientific discipline provided new tools for understanding mythological narratives as reflections of universal human experiences rather than simply as cultural artifacts or moral allegories. Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theories offered particularly influential interpretations of the Medusa myth that connected it to fundamental patterns of human psychological development and the structure of the unconscious mind. In his essay, Medusa's Head, Freud interpreted the Gorgon as a symbol of castration, anxiety, the male child's fear of losing his sexual organs as punishment for his desires. According to this reading, Medusa's serpentine hair represents the female genitalia, while her petrifying gaze symbolizes the paralyzing terror that the sight of female sexuality can inspire in men who have not successfully resolved their Oedipal conflicts. Freud's interpretation, while controversial and deeply problematic from contemporary feminist perspectives, was influential in establishing Medusa as a figure whose significance transcended her literal mythological context. His work suggested that the persistent power of her image derived from its connection to unconscious psychological processes that operate across cultures and historical periods. Carl Jung offered alternative psychological interpretations that emphasized Medusa's connection to archetypal patterns in the collective unconscious. For Jung, she represented the terrible mother archetype, the destructive aspect of the feminine that must be encountered and integrated before psychological wholeness can be achieved. Her petrifying gaze symbolized the overwhelming nature of contact with unconscious contents that individuals are not prepared to integrate into conscious awareness. Jungian interpretations proved more compatible with feminist approaches to mythology, as they recognized both the destructive and creative aspects of feminine power while avoiding the reductive gender stereotypes that characterized Freudian analysis. Jung's work suggested that Medusa's significance lay not in male anxieties about female sexuality, but in universal human encounters with the transformative power of the unconscious mind. The emergence of feminist literary criticism and gender studies in the 1960s and 1970s created entirely new frameworks for understanding the Medusa myth. Feminist scholars like Helene Sixis, Julia and Susan Gubar began to read her story not as a heroic narrative about masculine triumph over chaotic feminine forces, but as a cautionary tale about the systematic oppression of women and the violent suppression of feminine power. Sixis's influential essay, The Laugh of the Medusa, 1975, completely reversed traditional interpretations of the myth, presenting Medusa not as a monster to be feared, but as a symbol of authentic feminine expression that patriarchal culture seeks to silence. According to Sixis, men have constructed the image of Medusa as terrifying precisely because they fear the power of women's voices, bodies, and experiences. The petrifying gaze becomes a metaphor for the way that authentic feminine expression can challenge and destabilize masculine authority, this feminist reinterpretation fundamentally changed how contemporary culture understands the relationship between Perseus and Medusa. Rather than a hero defeating a monster, Perseus became a representative of patriarchal violence, destroying feminine wisdom and power. The myth was reread as an allegory for the historical process by which goddess-worshipping cultures were conquered and supplanted by patriarchal warrior societies. Modern archaeological discoveries provided empirical support for these feminist interpretations by revealing the extent to which Mediterranean cultures had indeed worshipped powerful female deities before the rise of classical Greek civilization. The work of scholars like Marija Gimbutas documented the prevalence of goddess imagery in Neolithic Europe, while excavations in Crete revealed the central importance of female deities in Minoan culture. These discoveries suggested that the transformation of Medusa from goddess to monster reflected actual historical processes rather than purely literary or symbolic developments. The myth preserved cultural memories of religious and social transformations that had occurred thousands of years before the emergence of written literature. Contemporary artists began creating works that explicitly challenged traditional heroic interpretations of the Perseus and Medusa story. Feminist artists like Judy Chicago, Nancy Sparrow, and Kiki Smith created powerful visual representations of Medusa that emphasized her victimization while reclaiming her as a symbol of feminine strength and resistance. These artistic reinterpretations often focused on the rape that preceded Medusa's transformation, presenting it as the crucial element that traditional male-centered readings had ignored or minimized. By highlighting this aspect of her story, feminist artists transformed Medusa into a symbol for all women who have suffered sexual violence and been blamed for their own victimization. The development of trauma studies provided additional frameworks for understanding Medusa's significance in contemporary culture. Her transformation from beautiful woman to monster could be interpreted as representing the psychological and social effects of traumatic experience, particularly sexual trauma. The petrifying gaze became a metaphor for the way that trauma can freeze victims in states of psychological paralysis and social isolation. This trauma-informed reading of the myth resonated with contemporary understanding of how sexual violence affects survivors, creating new possibilities for therapeutic and artistic engagement with Medusa imagery. Support groups and healing programs began using her symbol to represent both the reality of traumatic transformation and the possibility of reclaiming power in the aftermath of victimization. Modern art movements also found new aesthetic possibilities in Medusa, imagery that reflected contemporary concerns about technology, media, and visual culture. Surrealist artists like Salvador Dali and André Breton were fascinated by her connection to transformation and the unconscious mind, creating dreamlike images that explored the fluid boundaries between human and animal, beautiful and monstrous, life and death. Pop artists like Andy Warhol engaged with Medusa as a media icon, exploring how mythological images function in contemporary consumer culture. Warhol's screen prints of classical Medusa heads treated her as another celebrity image to be reproduced, commodified, and consumed, raising questions about how ancient symbols maintain their power in modern commercial contexts. Contemporary horror films and literature have also drawn extensively on Medusa imagery, but often with significant modifications that reflect modern anxieties about technology, body horror, and social alienation. These adaptations frequently emphasize the technological aspects of her power, the way that her gaze functions like a weapon or machine, while exploring how ancient myths can be adapted to address contemporary fears about surveillance, genetic manipulation, and digital transformation. The internet age has created new possibilities for engaging with Medusa imagery that bypass traditional cultural gatekeepers and allow for more diverse and democratic interpretations. Online communities of artists, writers, and activists have created extensive networks of Medusa-inspired content that challenges traditional narratives while developing new symbolic meanings appropriate to digital culture. Social media platforms have become spaces where Medusa imagery is used to discuss contemporary issues related to gender, power, and resistance. The hashtag #MeToo movement, in particular, has adopted Medusa symbolism to represent both the reality of sexual violence and the power of survivors to speak truth to power, even when that truth is uncomfortable or threatening to established interests. Academic disciplines beyond psychology and gender studies have also contributed to contemporary understanding of Medusa's significance. Anthropologists have explored how similar myths function in cultures around the world, revealing universal patterns in how societies process anxieties about transformation, death, and feminine power. Neuroscientists have investigated the psychological mechanisms that make certain visual images particularly compelling or disturbing, providing new insights into why Medusa's appearance has such persistent emotional impact. The environmental movement has found in Medusa a powerful symbol for the relationship between human civilization and the natural world. Her connection to serpents and transformation makes her an appropriate emblem for concerns about ecological destruction and the need for fundamental changes in how humans relate to their environment. Climate activists have used her image to represent both the destructive consequences of environmental degradation and the potential for regenerative transformation. Contemporary fashion and popular culture have also embraced Medusa imagery, but often in ways that sanitize or commercialize her significance. High-end fashion brands like Versace have adopted the Gorgon head as a luxury logo, while popular films and television shows present her as an exotic villain or supernatural threat. These commercial appropriations reflect broader tensions in how contemporary culture engages with ancient symbols, the desire to access their powerful emotional resonance, while avoiding the challenging questions they raise about power, justice, and social transformation. The result is often a superficial engagement that captures the aesthetic appeal of mythological imagery while ignoring its deeper significance. Yet even these commercialized versions of Medusa maintain some connection to her original power as a figure who challenges conventional boundaries and expectations. Her image continues to evoke responses that go beyond simple consumer recognition, suggesting that her mythological significance cannot be entirely contained by commercial exploitation. The modern gaze upon Medusa thus reflects the complexity and contradictions of contemporary culture itself, its capacity for both profound insight and superficial consumption. its simultaneous embrace of ancient wisdom and rejection of traditional authority, its ongoing struggles with questions of gender, power, and social justice that have no easy answers. As we move further into the 21st century, Medusa continues to serve as a mirror reflecting our own cultural anxieties and aspirations, our fears about transformation and our hopes for renewal, our recognition of past injustices, and our commitment to creating more equitable futures. Her ancient story remains vibrantly alive, constantly evolving to address new circumstances while preserving its essential insights into the human condition. The eternal return as our journey through 5 millennia of Medusa's mythological evolution draws to a close. We find ourselves confronting the same fundamental questions that have haunted humanity since we first began telling stories about gods and monsters, heroes and victims, transformation and death. What does it mean to look upon the face of ultimate truth? How do cultures deal with the violent suppression of older ways of life? Why do certain symbols persist across vast spans of time, while others fade into historical obscurity? The story we have traced reveals Medusa as one of the most psychologically complex and culturally significant figures in Western mythology. From her origins as a life-giving goddess of transformation in Neolithic cultures, to her modern incarnation as a symbol of feminine resistance and survivor strength, she has served as a mirror reflecting each age's deepest concerns about power, gender, sexuality, and social order. Her transformation from goddess to monster, and from monster to symbol, illustrates one of the most important processes in cultural history: how conquering civilizations absorb, reinterpret, and ultimately domesticate the sacred traditions of the peoples they displace. The Greeks did not simply destroy the goddess cultures they encountered. They transformed their symbols and narratives to serve new social and religious purposes. Medusa's petrifying gaze, which had once represented the transformative power of the divine feminine, became a weapon in the hands of patriarchal heroes and a protective emblem for the new masculine gods. Yet, this process of cultural appropriation was never complete or entirely successful. The power of Medusa's original nature as a goddess of transformation proved too fundamental to be entirely erased. Even in her diminished form as a head on Athena's shield, she retained the capacity to inspire awe, fear, and wonder. Her serpentine hair continued to writhe with life. Her blood maintained its dual properties of healing and destruction. Her gaze remained capable of stopping viewers in their tracks and forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and their world. The persistence of these elements across thousands of years of cultural change suggests that Medusa represents something more than a local mythological figure or cultural artifact. She embodies archetypal patterns that speak to universal human experiences: the encounter with the numinous, the confrontation with mortality, the recognition of the terrible beauty that lies at the heart of existence itself. Modern psychological and feminist interpretations have revealed how her myth encodes fundamental insights about trauma, transformation, and the relationship between victim and perpetrator. Her story provides a template for understanding how individuals and cultures deal with experiences of violence and loss, how they construct narratives of heroism and monstrosity, and how they struggle to integrate painful truths into coherent worldviews. The feminist reclamation of Medusa as a symbol of resistance and survivor strength represents perhaps the most significant mythological reversal of our time. By reading her story as one of victimization rather than monstrosity, contemporary scholars and artists have restored her voice and agency while revealing the gender dynamics that shaped her original transformation. This reinterpretation has transformed her from a cautionary tale about the dangers of feminine power into an inspiring narrative about the possibility of reclaiming that power in the face of systematic oppression. The archaeological evidence that supports these feminist readings, the prevalence of goddess imagery in pre-Greek Mediterranean cultures, the protective functions of Gorgon symbols, the connection between Medusa imagery and fertility and regenerations demonstrates how modern scholarship can recover historical truths that had been obscured by centuries of patriarchal interpretation. The goddess behind the monster has been revealed, not through wishful thinking or ideological projection, but through careful analysis of material evidence and cultural patterns. Yet, even as we celebrate these new insights, we must acknowledge the complexity and ambiguity that continues to characterize Medusa's symbolic significance. She remains a figure who resists simple interpretation, who embodies contradictions that cannot be easily resolved through any single theoretical framework. She is simultaneously victim and victor, beautiful and terrible, dead and eternally alive, ancient and urgently contemporary. This irreducible complexity is perhaps the key to her enduring power as a mythological figure. Unlike symbols that can be decoded and dismissed once their meanings are understood, Medusa continues to generate new interpretations and inspire fresh artistic and intellectual engagement. Each age finds in her story new relevance to its own concerns, while discovering previously hidden layers of meaning that earlier interpreters had missed. Digital age has created new possibilities for engaging with her myth that reflect contemporary concerns about surveillance, image manipulation, and the power of visual media. Her petrifying gaze takes on new meaning in an era of constant visual stimulation and digital transformation, where screens mediate most human interactions, and where the line between reality and representation has become increasingly blurred. Environmental concerns have also found expression through Medusa imagery, as her connection to serpents and natural cycles makes her an appropriate symbol for earth-based spirituality and ecological consciousness. Climate activists and environmental artists have drawn on her transformative power to represent both the destructive consequences of environmental degradation and the potential for regenerative change. The ongoing relevance of Medusa to contemporary social justice movements demonstrates how ancient myths can be reactivated to address current political and cultural struggles. Her image has become associated with movements for gender equality, survivors' rights, and resistance to authoritarianism, suggesting that her power as a symbol of transformation and resistance transcends the specific historical contexts in which she originally emerged. Yet, we must also acknowledge the ways in which her myth continues to be misused or misinterpreted in contemporary culture. Commercial appropriations that reduce her to a fashion logo or horror movie villain miss the profound psychological and spiritual significance that has made her such an enduring figure. Superficial engagements with her imagery may actually reinforce the very patterns of objectification and commodification that feminist interpretations seek to challenge. The responsibility of those who engage with Medusa's myth, scholarly, artistic, or spiritual contexts is therefore to approach her with the respect and complexity she deserves, to resist the temptation to reduce her to simple formulas or ideological talking points, while remaining open to the transformative power that has made her story resonate across cultures and millennia. As we look toward the future, it seems certain that Medusa will continue to evolve and inspire new interpretations that reflect changing social conditions and emerging cultural concerns. New archaeological discoveries may reveal additional aspects of her prehistoric origins. Advances in psychology and neuroscience may provide fresh insights into why her image has such powerful emotional effects, and ongoing struggles for social justice may find in her story new resources for understanding and addressing contemporary forms of oppression and resistance. What seems unlikely to change is her fundamental nature as a figure who challenges comfortable assumptions and forces viewers to confront difficult truths about power, violence, beauty, and transformation. She will continue to serve as a mirror, reflecting our own cultural blind spots and unconscious biases, a gorgoneion whose gaze stops us in our tracks and demands that we examine our own motivations and assumptions. The ancient goddess who became a monster and then became a symbol has achieved a form of immortality that transcends any single cultural context or historical period. Her story has become part of the permanent inheritance of human consciousness, a mythological resource that each generation can draw upon to address its own unique challenges while connecting with the universal human experiences of transformation, loss, and renewal in the end. Perhaps this is Medusa's greatest gift to us, not the petrification that stops life in its tracks, but the transformation that allows old forms to die so that new ones can be born. Her serpentine hair continues to writhe with the eternal motion of change itself, reminding us that nothing in this world is permanent except the process of becoming something else. The stone-cold killer was indeed once a stone-cold goddess, but she has become something more than either a living symbol whose meaning continues to evolve as human consciousness itself transforms. Her gaze, which once turned flesh to stone, now turns stone back to flesh, awakening ancient wisdom to address contemporary needs and connecting us to the eternal dance of death and rebirth that governs all existence. She looks back at us across the centuries with eyes that have seen the rise and fall of civilizations, the triumph and defeat of gods and heroes, the endless cycle of forgetting and remembering that shapes human culture. In her gaze, we see not our own destruction, but our own potential for transformation, the terrible and wonderful possibility that we too might shed our old skins and emerge renewed, that we too might die to what we were and be reborn as what we might become. The serpents in her hair whisper of changes yet to come, of stories yet to be told, of truths yet to be revealed. Medusa's myth is not finished. Peakage continues to unfold in every act of resistance against injustice, every moment of transformation from victim to survivor, every recognition that what appears monstrous may actually be sacred, and what appears dead may actually be eternally, vibrantly alive. If you found this deep exploration of Medusa's true history compelling, you might enjoy our other investigations into the hidden origins of mythology's most misunderstood figures. Consider subscribing to join us as we continue unmasking the ancient truths behind the stories we think we know.